Hi again guys, and welcome to our second review, of course, from the new selection of 7 cars in the 1.31 patch, and this time following on from yesterday's tune setup for this car in N300 for earning a ton of cash. We're now taking a look at the review side of the Ferrari F50. Now this car is one of the most useful from the pack, and not just because you can earn a ton of cash from it, but because of course it has multi-class use, unlike something such as the McLaren from yesterday, and it was also a hugely anticipated car. So many people have wanted a Ferrari F50 in Gran Turismo basically from day one, but especially from when Ferrari was included, of course, around GT5. So this one finally arriving in the franchise, it's a long time coming, but it's very cool that it's finally here. Now in terms of what this car can do, what it's capable of, even the specs, it definitely differentiates itself from the F40 in a number of ways. A lot of people prefer the F40. I personally have always preferred the F50. It's one of those very rare occasions when I had an opinion as a kid. I knew which one I preferred, and it actually hasn't really changed over time. That doesn't happen that often for me. Generally my tastes end up being the exact opposite of what they used to be, but for this one it has remained constant. For me, the F40 is a car that, much like the Nissan GTR and the McLaren F1, I have a lot more respect for it than love. I don't love the Ferrari F40 at all. In terms of the F50, I've always liked this car more from a design point of view, especially from the back. I love that iconic integrated wing, which itself of course was carried over from the F40, and also just the look of the back end in general I think is really cool. One of the reasons why I like stuff like the Vector M12 as well is because it's kind of reminiscent of that similar design style. And of course you can probably think of a couple of other cars that have that style as well, even something like the Venturi 400, which is very Ferrari F40-esque with that integrated rear wing, and to some degree you could even say stuff like the Maserati MC12 and the Mercedes CLK GTR from, of course, the more GT1 era of Le Mans racing. Now as far as this car goes, of course it's from the 90s, the mid-90s in particular, one of the very few supercars to actually have essentially a detuned Formula 1 engine. You would assume that that would be something that was done more often, but funnily enough it actually isn't. And one of the issues, of course, of trying to detune a race engine and putting it into a street car is that it's simply not designed for reliability. It's designed for a relatively short period of driving in comparison to what a road car has to do, with start-stop traffic, thousands upon thousands of miles between services, etc. That's just not something that a race car would ever have to worry about. So it inherently brings up issues with stuff like running costs, reliability, the wear on the engine, and of course in a game, the great part about all of that is you don't need to worry. In real life you do, but in a game you just don't. You can appreciate all of the good stuff about a car's performance and its engine and the sound without having to even think about stuff like running costs. Now, this car, in comparison to its greatest rival, you could say, the F40 itself, squares up really well. It's a lot more expensive, it's almost 2 million credits, and I know a lot of people were disappointed by that. It could make sense for around 400,000 to 500,000 as well. That would also be appropriate, I think, for this car. But the 1.9 million credit price doesn't actually bother me. It certainly feels worth it, given that you can literally pay for itself within about an hour of Blue Moon Bay racing. So when you put it that way, that's not exactly a lot of work to pay off what you spent. And what you spend gets you a lot of ability. Now with Ferrari, you don't typically expect them to have class-leading numbers generally. They don't tend to have the most powerful engines around, or they're not necessarily the lightest car on the grid always. But what they do is they tend to have a very strong mix of everything, which doesn't make them the fastest in a straight line, but gives them very good trackability, especially from a road car. And that's exactly what the F50 has, because I was expecting this to be kind of a slippery car, maybe twitchy. The F40 itself can sometimes be fairly twitchy and slippery. With the right tuning you can totally change its profile. It's a very workable car and a very competitive one, but straight out of the box it's not really beginner friendly at all. The F50 on the other hand shocked me. This is so easy to drive, and the handling is actually pretty much the polar opposite to what I was expecting. You've actually got much more understeer than oversteer, which is a cool, not necessarily problem, but a cool characteristic, let's say, for the car to have, because it means that the handling is much more predictable than something like an NSX Super GT car or an Audi R8 LMS, which is what I was assuming this might feel like. Now, I never use the F50 that much in other games that do have it, such as Forza for instance, but in Gran Turismo, again because of the fact that we have less cars to work with, which increases the exposure that each car gets, especially new ones, I've never used any F50 in any game as much as I already have used this one in GT Sport. I've already put more miles on it than pretty much any other game that I've driven it in. And that, combined with the fact that it's such a good representation of the car, means that to me, if someone like me who likes the car but doesn't put it as one of their favourites can enjoy it that much, I think if you were looking forward, or hoping at least, to have an F50 in Gran Turismo at some point, if, say, it's one of your favourite cars, maybe even your favourite car for some people, then you're not going to be disappointed. This car is brilliant. It's usable. The price is not ridiculous, but it certainly makes it feel like it has worth. It's a substantial price. The performance is very good, and just like a Porsche, just like an NSX, just like a few others as well, what it can do goes way beyond the raw numbers on paper. Because on paper, it doesn't necessarily sound that remarkable. 4.7 litre engine, only 511 horsepower, which is less than a Jaguar XJ220, that's less than a Bugatti EB110, that's less than quite a few other supercars from the 90s, so it doesn't sound that impressive. Like I said earlier, Ferrari doesn't typically go for that. But when you look at the weight, on the other hand, it weighs less than a rally car, less than a WRC car from around 2008 from Gran Turismo 6, like a Focus or an Impreza. 1,230 kilos is really good, and you can drop it even lower. Now, the standard horsepower per tonne, even with only just over 500 horsepower to begin with, is 411. And that's good. I mean, bearing in mind something like a Veyron, with literally double the power, has what, 530 horsepower per tonne? This has 411. That's not a huge difference given how massively different the power is. And of course, that's because of the weight. It's such a lightweight supercar, especially by today's standards. Again, as I mentioned with the McLaren yesterday, supercars are getting heavier and heavier because of tech, whereas this is a perfect example of a supercar that doesn't really rely on tech. It's not an electronic car, it's a very analog one, and even though it feels more tech heavy in terms of its visual style than the F40 ever did, which looks just bare bones like I would often say the Land Rover of supercars, the F50 looks like it's probably more technologically advanced, but the reality is it's actually still kind of a race car for the street. Except the difference is the F40 feels kind of like a GT car for the street, like almost a prototype level machine in some ways, whereas the F50 feels much more like a formula car for the street, which of course there's a good reason for that, it shares that DNA. Across the board, I'm very impressed with this interpretation of the car. It's definitely the most enjoyment I've had with an F50 in any game that I've driven it on. It sounds good, it looks very good, the interior cam is nice quality too with the textures as you'd hope it would be, and the handling was shockingly good. So if you were looking forward to this, yeah, you should definitely save up the 1.9 million. It does not take that long to get that cash, and once you buy this car, if you love it, you're going to use it a lot because you can get a ton of use out of it. N500 as standard, you can detune it further than the F40, which is kind of strange, down to N300. Peak power isn't hugely impressive, it's 640 horsepower, but of course you have to bear in mind, this is a naturally aspirated car. The F40 is turbo aspirated, so in comparison, of course this one's going to have a different kind of characteristic to it. So in a similar way to a Zonda, for instance, it's more of this pure engine vibe than something like a Huayra, which has the turbo aspiration and far more power, far more torque. They're just totally different animals. Likewise, the F40 and the F50, although so close technically, are also very, very different to each other. And for me, there is no question, I prefer the F50 in every way over the F40. For me, I always have, and I still do. So if you were looking forward to it, you're going to enjoy it. If you're not an F50 fan, its raw ability might just win you over. But that's it overall for this pick. Of course, if you haven't checked out my tune for it yesterday, you can click here on screen at the end to do that. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.